work with my kids. You're obviously looking for a bit of paternalism. Okay, so this is our third session of the day, first of the afternoon, pregnancy surveillance in the medical profession. So we have two presentations, one historical presentation, and then another one more about contemporary policy, discussing epigenetics, which was raised by Claire, I think, in the previous session. And then we have Rebecca Schiller from Birthrights, who's going to be the respondent. And we have to finish at 2:45 exactly, I'm told. So our first speaker is Dr. Salim Al-Gailani from the University of Cambridge, and he's going to be giving a presentation called Capturing the Womb, Pregnancy Surveillance in Early 20th Century Britain. And then he'll be followed by Professor Sue White, Professor of Social Work at the University of Sheffield, and she'll be talking about the social implications of genetics.
If it's possible, could you please move the microphone? Just in the earlier ones, they were a bit difficult to hear.
Can you hear me now? So
great,
fantastic. Thank you very much to Jenny for the invitation. It's been really a fantastic day so far. As a historian, I'm going back about 100 years to revisit the origins of what's really a new idea in. Sorry, it keeps cutting out. Can you hear me okay?
No, yeah, it keeps cutting out.
So I'm revisiting the origins of a very new idea in public health. So that's the idea that all mothers should receive medical supervision during pregnancy. So around World War I, there were perhaps a handful of antenatal clinics. In Britain, within a decade, there were several hundred. So antenatal care is perhaps best understood as part of a profusion of turn-of-the-century programs of social reform, focused on the governance of the bodies, in particular of the working classes, who were represented simultaneously as a scourge of the nation, but also its most precious resource. So innovations in maternal and infant welfare, including the medical supervision of expectant mothers, all came from the view that mothers and babies should be routinely inspected and disciplined to promote health and efficiency. So early advocates conceived of the antenatal clinic as both a site of medical and moral surveillance, intended on the one hand to identify medical complications, but also to inculcate habits of self-regulation among the allegedly deficient working class mothers who were the principal target. So I'd like to start the talk with an image which captures quite nicely three key features of antenatal care in the early 20th century. So the first is a reminder that sort of pregnancy surveillance in this quite early period is really about reducing infant rather than maternal mortality. Although this will become increasingly featured by the 20s and 30s, it's very much focused on improving the health of children. Second, the image speaks to taboos that then restricted clear and open communication about pregnancy in the early 20th century. So in Jenny's talk, we had lots of images of pregnant bumps. As a historian, it's quite frustrating that it's difficult to find that kind of image for this period. So visual representations of pregnant women in materials for mixed audiences were extremely rare. The third point is that welfare and antenatal care is very much gendered female and identified with welfare. So the image captures how supervision of pregnancy was very much part of the emergence of a more feminized public health in the first decades of the 20th century. So previously public health is a much more kind of masculine domain. Increasingly by the early 20th century, it becomes much more targeted towards mothers and babies. So very much centered on the welfare of working class mothers and children, and involves the recruitment of newly professionalized midwives, health visitors, nurses, sort of female-dominated healthcare professions. So the image should be seen as an intervention in an already quite lively debate about where responsibility for the supervision of pregnancy lay, public health or private medicine, and more generally, to what extent pregnancy was a public matter at all, a central theme of this talk. So a couple of the key themes then. So first of all, it's to outline, to give you a sense of the professional and political landscape for the governance of pregnancy in early 20th century Britain, very much the framework within which these new antenatal clinics emerged. And second, also to recover what was considered to be the most prominent problem with antenatal care around World War I. So how to link up expectant mothers with these new public health services. And really this is a way of revisiting some of the themes that were first opened up by Anne Oakley in her 1984 book, The Captured Womb. Is in many ways still the only history of the management of pregnancy and antenatal care from around 1900 to the present. Okay, so it's important to recognise that health provision for expectant mothers was heavily contested territory. Health professionals of various kinds fought bitterly over almost every aspect of antenatal care, what it should entail, who should provide it, and where. And most of these questions boiled down to professional boundary disputes, so over work spheres and responsibilities of the various occupational groups, institutions and agencies involved in maternity care. But they were also folded into much more general preoccupations of gender, class, of broad significance, about citizenship and political rights, the authority of medicine, and perhaps most importantly, the legitimacy of state interference in family life. So it's worth emphasising that the amount of contact between medicine and the expectant mother was really quite limited in the period before the turn of the 20th century. By around 1900, maternity charities were opening up some kinds of medical treatment, advice and material aid before confinement, but serious medical and political interest in supervision of pregnancy really emerges only around World War I. With the growth of the infant welfare movement. So antenatal care comes into prominence as part of a raft of policy innovations, midwifery reform, notification of births, which established a health visiting service, the availability of funds to enable local government to develop and rationalise health services for mothers and children. But this remained very much what historians call a mixed economy of welfare, with private philanthropy in particular still very conspicuous. So the point is that these new services were very much local rather than national government initiatives. Really before the foundation of the NHS, and even to some extent afterwards, there's still huge local variation in provision. But even as activity in maternity and child welfare intensified around World War I, the terminology, the practice of antenatal care remains really unstable and contested. And there's much disagreement over the question of professional responsibility for supervision, whether this work can be delegated to GPs, to midwives, to health visitors, or required specialist input. And there's also conflict over the remits of local health officials, the medical officers of health, that are becoming much more assertive as they attempted to extend their authority. So the number of antenatal clinics grew rapidly in number during the war, typically as part of more complex local infant welfare schemes. But even the keenest proponents quickly come to realise that these new services were very poorly used. Officials complained about the difficulty of spreading the word that services existed and convincing women to use them. So expectant mothers are castigated as shy or resentful of medical inquisitiveness, while discussion of pregnancy was potentially also shameful. So as one health official puts it, these clinics were an affront to the delicacy and modesty with which we Britishers like to associate with our womenfolk. So early on, there was recognised to be a need for a coordinated strategy for getting in contact with expectant mothers who weren't behaving as officials hoped. So the attitudes of potential clients of maternity and infant welfare services are really notoriously difficult to access. And many historians have argued that working class mothers have ample reasons to view themselves not as the beneficiaries, but as the victims, where the local, state and voluntary sector largely controlled by more privileged middle class groups. So there's much evidence to suggest that, especially in this early period, that the new welfare services were a deeply resented and intrusive presence in the lives of the urban poor. And we get a flavour of this kind of attitude in a letter written by a Sterling mother to a local newspaper in Scotland from 1916. So she argues that infant welfare schemes are going to set the working classes by the ears, including, as it does, an antenatal clinic for expectant mothers and visiting. And what will inevitably happen, she says, is that well-meaning and officious societies are becoming to be government-assisted and encouraged get to work. So the system will only be enforced against the working classes. The mother must submit to the local clinic, pestered, questioned, examined by any person or a number of persons in charge. So very much a continuity of the kind of thing that we were discussing earlier on this morning. So it's in this context that health officials begin to discuss how to get more mothers into antenatal care. And the most widely debated and controversial solution was to establish a system for notifying pregnancy. So literally finding some way of getting women to register with a local official when they became pregnant. So this might seem far-fetched, especially because in this period pregnancy isn't entirely straightforward to diagnose. There are no lab tests, at least until the 1930s and 40s. But it's important to place these proposals in the wider context of a conversation about public health surveillance, what public health is actually for, what it can achieve, the balance of individual liberty and social good, and the reach of the state into the personal lives and homes of the working poor. So notification by this time was well established as an instrument of public health. Notification of infectious diseases was compulsory from 1899, extended to tuberculosis in 1913. And most importantly, the notification of pregnancy seems to some proponents only a small step from what already existed. So the early notification of births from 1915, which have proved very successful in establishing a health visiting service for newborn infants. So the proposal also come in the context of an emerging debate about the notification of venereal diseases. For the first time since the repeal of the highly controversial Contagious Diseases Act, which enabled doctors to inspect and incarcerate women suspected of prostitution. So this legislation had been a major catalyst for various forms of activism, both feminist and libertarian. So it's a really important moment in British political history. So the impetus for notification of pregnancy came from an increasingly confident and articulate body of medical officers of health, really sort of pushing their weight within various local authorities. So various models for doing this were proposed, ranging from the compulsory and coercive to the more sort of liberal and voluntary. But the common thread was a real optimism about notification as a formal system of surveillance for making health services more efficient and supplying local officials with information about the health and demographics of their districts. So proponents thought there were many benefits to notifying pregnancy. One of them was providing a check on abortion, an increasingly big concern for health officials and governments around this time. Another is the possibility of getting mothers with VD into treatment clinics. And another is the greater control it promised medical officers over midwives and GPs in sort of emerging welfare systems. So it should be said that central government civil servants, the Ministry of Health and its predecessor, were highly wary of these ideas. I think they're both ethical and practical. But they nonetheless tolerated a small but significant number of experimental notification of pregnancy schemes adopted by some local authorities. And the best known of these is in the Yorkshire Borough County of Huddersfield, which launched its own scheme in 1916. So Huddersfield is very much a pioneering centre of infant welfare. It has a particularly energetic, dogmatic, and high-profile medical officer of health. So his scheme is voluntary. He offers midwives a small fee for reporting the names of their clientele on booking to the local authority. So the mothers would then receive a visit at home during pregnancy by a female doctor employed by the authority. So the portion of notifications was initially quite small around World War I, but it expands to pretty much all women who become pregnant in Huddersfield by around World War II have their pregnancies notified by a midwife to the local authority. As a way of getting them into contact with these new services. So Huddersfield is quite unusual in many ways. It's by far the most enduring scheme, but it's not the only one by any means to adopt notification. But unsurprisingly, these schemes were met with much opposition. So there are three broad strands of resistance, which I briefly want to sketch. And the first comes from activists in the women's suffrage movement, and usually in conjunction with criticisms of new government interventions in BD, venereal disease policy. And more occasionally folded into critiques of maternal and infant welfare as targeted at women's assumed needs rather than their actual material circumstances. So it's important to say that the agitation around, for instance, the Contagious Diseases Act had given the women's movement a real sort of tradition of opposition to state intervention. And some feminists were arguing that the notification of pregnancies would once again kind of raise the spectre of compulsory, enforced medical examinations for all women. And only sort of full participation in public life would give them the agency to participate as full citizens and resist such intrusive measures. The second strand of opposition comes from general practitioners, from GPs, represented by the BNA. So building on long-standing suspicions of state interference in doctor-patient relationships, and including practices of notification. So a very strong critique of notification within the BNA, which successfully really prevented this from becoming national policy. But finally, and most importantly, from newly professionalising female health occupations, nurses, women sanitary inspectors, especially from midwives. And a leading critic was the Incorporated Midwives Institute, a lobby group committed to raising the status of midwives as an independent trained professional, a forerunner of the Royal College of Midwives. Made up, it must be said, mostly of metropolitan, educated, middle class women. So the Midwives Act of 1902 had created the conditions for much closer engagement between local authorities and midwives, increasingly represented as agents of hygiene and social reform. So debates over notification were ultimately a symptom of the challenges faced by midwives in this new sort of professional climate, as they came to terms with a complex set of challenges relating to professional authority, respectability, and participation in public health. So the key question is whether midwives should be defined as agents of the state or as independent professionals. And these identities aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but had to be carefully navigated as midwives define their work sphere. So of course, a concern to midwives was that notification schemes, like in Huddersfield, effectively turned them into informants for the local state. And they were taking some bribes, effectively, to hand over their clients' information to health officials. And in so doing, they were undermining trust in their profession through a breach of patient confidentiality. So the concern is that midwives who complied with notification requests would lose clientele to their competitors who didn't sell their patients' business to the town hall. So there's a big debate in midwifery journals, nursing journals, and some feminist periodicals too, to condemning notification of pregnancy as an intolerable interference with the liberty of women, midwives and mothers alike. And there's a need to be a vigorous defence of the practice by medical officers of health, who open up a debate about the attitudes of working class mothers and the notion of family privacy. So midwives argue that it's a woman's right to decide when and whom to divulge knowledge of a pregnancy, and the worry of an official visit might deter mothers from an early booking. So for their part, proponents of notification claim that critics were vastly overstating working class hostility to local authority intervention, and accuse midwives of short-sightedness in pursuing professional interests over the national well-being. So the controversy brings to light divergent interpretations of both the powers of local authorities and the positions of the expectant mother within a modernising and increasingly ambitious state. So medical officers, sort of increasingly influential, sort of argue that notification is a way of making a more streamlined, efficient public health bureaucracy. But this vision of reproductive control clashes with conceptions of female citizenship and midwives' professional authority. So I love this quote from a midwife in a feminist journal, The Common Cause. The pregnant woman was neither drain nor dairy and could not be inspected as such, but rather she was a normal human being with opinions, tastes, fancies and rights of her own. So wartime controversy over notification should be understood in the context of a distinctly British debate over the propriety of health enforcement. So questions of morality have for decades framed discussion of such health interventions as vaccination, as VD control, notification too, all of which were contested in various ways as infringements of historic rights and freedoms of the British people. So resistance to these measures reflected many agendas, from medical practitioners' hostility to state interference, to the private relations between doctor and patient. But the most robust opposition came from midwives, and this is a reminder of the agency of this group in wider deliberations over public health reform. So up to this point, opposition to practice of notification had come chiefly from male doctors who argue that handing information to the state represents a breach of trust between practitioners and private patients. So debates over notification of pregnancy are significant because they draw in midwives, these professionalised, comparatively lowly, increasingly female occupations, into this new politics of paperwork, privacy, and ethics. And this really helps to shape the emergence of a more feminised public health system, which antenatal care was increasingly part. So just a couple of concluding remarks. This episode sort of tells us a lot about the formation of what the modern surveillance system around pregnancy in the early 20th century. So resistance from midwives and GPs too appears to be being largely effective in dissuading authorities from adopting a practice. But notification of pregnancy schemes also operate in isolated pockets throughout the interwar period. And at the very least continue to provoke a discussion as health officials debated how to improve the reach of these new antenatal services and by application of surveillance of pregnancy. So by the 20s, health officials appeared largely to have agreed that direct forms of surveillance were impractical, and a more orthodox approach was to rely on more incremental reforms designed to cultivate awareness and acceptance of antenatal clinics. So most significant in this respect are the sort of resources devoted to mothercraft, literature targeted at pregnant women in particular. So antenatal care comes to be much more about naturalising expectant motherhood as a form of citizenship that came with rights and responsibilities as it was about medical supervision. So all these new services will part of the moral apparatus increasingly that position mothers as healthy, sober and self-governing citizens.
Thank you, Salim. Really can't hear at the back. It sounds like the mic problem isn't necessarily going to be resolved. There's loads of seats down here if you want to move quickly as Sue comes and sets us up. There's lots of seats on the front row if you want to.
Okay, we're quite short of time, I think, so I will press on. That's a little plug for my book, but the main purpose of putting that up is to acknowledge the work of my partner in Life and Crime, Dave Wastel, who is also the author of most of the information that I'm going to cover today. I've called this Making Perfect People, and I think it fits into a lot of what we've heard already today, and most recently from Salim, about the aspiration to cure society of disorder and disease in various forms. At the moment, this is taking a particularly florid kind of biological, technical turn through new imaging in neuroscience and through developments in molecular biology, which are proving very seductive to policymakers. I'm Professor of Social Work, my background's in sociology academically, but obviously I have particular professional views on some of the directions that this is taking, particularly its movement into the child protection system. So, we haven't heard about the developmental origins of health and disease paradigm today directly, but here it is, and this is basically what we've been talking about all the way through. And it's just not equivocal at all in its aims. An unhealthy lifestyle in prospective parents passes greater risk of non-communicable diseases to the next generation. This perpetuates cycles of poor health, reduced productivity and shorter life expectancy, trapping populations in a trough of low human capital. If we have an overarching meta-narrative, it is that, from which they cannot easily escape. And then we move quickly on to women and what they should be doing about this. Evidence from epigenetics is that epigenetic change is potentially modifiable through lifestyle and diet. Advice to pregnant women on behaviour change to avoid exposure to potentially harmful factors during early embryonic development is likely to be particularly important. Houses of Parliament. So in response to some of the debate before about is this neoliberal, is it big state, it's actually both. Because this is incredibly appealing to both sides of the political spectrum. So that's why it's so potent, and that's why those of you who are health professionals in here, need to pay attention to its distorting effects. So we have a particular florid example of this way of thinking from Adam Perkins' 2015 book. I'm going to miss out the first quote because we're short of time, but basically he's saying, oh, the welfare state is in a mess because people are having too many children and they can't afford it. And he does acknowledge that this is based on animal experiments, saying selective breeding of personality causes significant genetically influenced changes in personality within as few as 5 generations. It should be noted that there is more variation in human mating than in selective breeding studies of the type cited here. Blah, blah, blah. Now, hang on to that, because rats are very important actors in the epigenetic script. We'll be meeting some more in a minute. And this is not just an extreme view, although Adam Perkins' book has rightly been criticised. He's a behavioural neuroscientist at King's College, so, you know, he should know what he's talking about. It's basically a eugenic argument, and we must remember that some of the biggest fans of eugenics were on the left. So this is David Cameron. Oh no, let's miss out David Cameron. We'll have the all-parliamentary working group. Again, cross-party consensus. The more citizens are physically and mentally healthy, well-educated, empathic, pro-social, hard-working and contributing to the cost of society, the better society will flourish. As there is a rise in proportions of citizens who are damaged physically or mentally ill, poor at relationships, antisocial, blah, blah, blah. In the UK today, there are too many citizens in the latter category. And the answer to this is parenting programmes. Not poverty reduction or housing or anything like that. So we've had this move. There was a big preoccupation with neuroscience, still is, the Harvard Centre for the Developing Child and so on. But we have that's now elided with developments in molecular biology. So we now have epigenetics stretching this potential risk over time and space, generations back and generations forward, as we heard from Claire earlier in relation to obesity. And I will definitely not be going out for a drink with Sally Davis. So what is epigenetics? Well, in a nutshell, and there is obviously a lot of technical detail, it examines additional mechanisms, usually methylation and histone modification, for modifying gene expression in the phenotype, in the way the organism presents and its health status and so on, without altering the fundamental DNA. So it's switching genes on and off in the popular argot. So this invites a natural interest in the impact of adverse conditions, such as deprivation and in normatively deficient parenting. So it's very Janus-based. It's being used politically in the slavery reparations movement, for example, to argue that people are carrying a biological marker of disadvantage, to politicise movements about increasing kind of social equality and so on, the impact of toxic environments and so on. But it also ushers in optimisation. You know, if people can be made better, then shouldn't we be making them better? And how best to do this, apart from the womb is the best place to do it. So if we, back in the days of hard heredity, when genes were inherited and fixed for life, that might trap people in all sorts of not very helpful narratives, and it obviously drove what Maurizio Maloney calls a barbarous utopia of fascism in Nazi Germany, which made eugenics not very popular for a while. This is a softer version. So epigenetics is showing signs of rendering biology political and moral again. So what implications are likely to ensue from a moral imperative that requires each generation to maintain the quality of the human genome and epigenome for the next generation in no worse condition than they received it? Does it change your opinion of your mother if you see yourself not as one in a long line of worriers, but as somebody whose mother made bad choices at some point in the past, and therefore you are somehow epigenetically damaged and so on? So what do we actually know from studies of epigenetics? Well, there is a lot of work on plants and individual molecules inside cells, and very, very complicated molecular biology. There's also a lot of work, ecological work, using animal models, which have been very influential. I'll say something more about those in a minute. Studies on humans, for obvious ethical reasons, are difficult to do. So we have the impact of natural disasters. The biggest ones are the Dutch hunger winter and the Canadian ice storm. Apart from those, the work is mostly on rats. The work of Michael Meany, his work on rats has been extremely influential. So, particularly in relation to what is known as fetal programming, which no doubt those of you in midwifery will have heard of. So this is Vivek Glover, who is working on fetal programming in humans. She says, Meany and his group have shown how variation in maternal care can have long-lasting effects. Offspring of mothers showing more maternal care are both less anxious and have less pronounced corticosteroid response to a new stressor. And that this is being shown by the epigenetic changes in the brain. It's also been extremely, it's been noted in the popular press, and this is from the Daily Telegraph. The 2004 study showed that rat pups who had been repeatedly groomed by their mother during the first week of life were subsequently better at coping with stressful situations than pups who really received little or no contact. So this is, and when you read, you will be, midwives, when you pick up papers on human fetal programming, they will all cite Meany. They will all say there is a body of work on rats, or they'll not say rats, they'll say there is a body of work on animals. And then they'll go on to just gloss all this. but we actually need to know what Mealy found. So here we have good mothering. The good mother licks and grooms and does high arch back nursing. And this produces chilled out pups. The bad mother doesn't lick and groom her pups, and she's probably going to the pub, or majoritively be going to work. Anyway, these pups are a lot more agitated, and this is to do with the methylation caused by neglectful mothering in the glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus. Now, hang on to that for a minute as well. This is not the emotion centres of the brain prima facie, this is the hippocampus. So, this is getting a bit complicated, but I'll just try and summarise it. What Dave Wassell and I did is we thought, well, where have they got this? Let's have a look. Why are they looking at methylation in the hippocampus? So they do all this to the rats, and then they kind of blast their brains and they work out how much methylation level there is in the hippocampus. So Dave started life as a neuroscientist, so this curiosity was a bit piqued by this. So we went back in time to look at some papers from the past, and this is quite hard work because they all come with enormous methodological appendices, about 50 pages long, where they actually tell you what manipulations were done to the rats. So when you go back and have a look to 1985, you find a study on handling of pups, which was all to do with resilience in early stress, which at the time was a popular psychological theory. So what they were trying to do is kind of annoy these rats a bit and see whether it made them resilient. Well, that's a very unpopular view now, isn't it? We're all supposed to be licked and groomed and, all the time then. And this showed that rats which had been handled by experimenters and separated from their mothers for 15 minutes every day showed 24% higher concentrations of glucocorticoid receptor in the hippocampus. It doesn't explain why human handling in that study and maternal separation seem to have the same effect in developing a greater level of resilience. And it seems a little contradictory, but actually there is a link between these things, because when you look at the paper on licking and grooming, you find, when you look at, this is very complicated, when you look at the paper on handling, you get a response from the mother when the pup is put back into the cage. The pup squeals like mad, and the mum, what does she do? She produces a lot of high arch back nursing and licking and grooming behaviour. So we also noted that the average licking and grooming rate in the original study for the handled pups, whose mothers are then desperately trying to, oh God, they're back, oh good. They get 155 licks and grooms, whatever they are, in the observational period, compared with 78 for the non-handled pups. Again, hang on to that. So the normal, undisturbed rats have a licking and grooming rate of 78. So the high licking and grooming behaviour appears to have been produced by the intervention of the experimenters. But a profound reversal takes place in the later Mealy experiments, where the new normal is the high licking and grooming behaviour. Now, we're not told how this happens. We just have to think, interesting. Maybe the laboratory has produced an entirely new phenotype. Doesn't seem to have occurred to them, but it is perfectly possible. So, I haven't got the slide which shows you the difference, but you just have to take my word for it. The licking and grooming rate for the neglectful mothers in the later study was the same as the normal licking and grooming rate in the original study, so hang on to that. And we can see the direction of travel in this work with this other paper by Roth et al. Now, what they did in a nutshell was they got a group of rat mothers, and when the rats had just given birth, they took away their nesting material. and the rat mother just went a bit bonkers, really, as you would. So the rat's kind of stomping around and desperately looking for nesting material, one assumes, and in the process tramples her pups. Now this is explicitly described in the paper as abusive. And they showed low posture nursing positions, presumably because they were too busy trying to find something for their babies to lie on. Now, interestingly, they reversed this methylation with a methylation inhibiting drug. So there you go, another motif. Are we going to cure social disadvantage with methylation inhibiting drugs? Are we? I'll leave that to you, the health professionals, to decide. So we have this peculiar new utopia arising from these fetal programming studies, which appears to be the eradication of worrying. Now everybody knows that it's very difficult to do experiments like the rat ones on people for obvious reasons. I mean, you might say there is a social experiment going on in people's reduction of people's resources, but you know, they're not in controlled laboratory conditions. So what we tend to have is some sort of simulation of anxiety. So this is a typical study by Buss et al, and they look at the impact of pregnancy anxiety on brain morphology in 6 to 9-year-old children. They measure maternal anxiety at 19, 25 and 31 weeks. All they're interested in is levels of worrying about pregnancy. These are normal women. They are not in a mental health population. I'm not suggesting if people are, they're not normal. But these people are they're not in any kind of clinical category. And they don't measure the children's cognitive development, so note that. A number of these mothers, not very many, 35, agree to MRI scans of their children later on, and they conclude that pregnancy anxiety was not correlated with total brain matter volume, but differences were found in a number of brain areas for women reporting higher anxiety in the first trimester. So what? Anyway, despite the children being normal, no emotional and behavioural problems noted, they go on to speculate that reduced volume in areas of prefrontal cortex might lead to delayed cognitive and motor development. Well, I think it was Ellie made the point earlier that there's some kind of negativity about skew in the reporting of results, and you can see this with here as well. So they further speculate how higher concentrations of stress hormones might cause further delays, except they haven't. So why is this attractive? So I'll finish in a second. What we have is the emergence of fetal programming, and people are we're not talking about potentially toxic substances like alcohol, and we saw how equivocal that evidence base was. We're talking about stress here. There's something like 175,000 hits on Google Scholar for stress and the HPA axis, and it is huge. So why is stress suddenly so bad? All stress, including worrying about your pregnancy. Great paradox there. So we have the Glasgow epigenetics study, which is trying to work out why people in Glasgow have poorer health outcomes. And they're looking at methylation, basically inflammatory markers actually. This is the Glasgow Herald noting the study. The other thing to note about methylation, or the myth of methylation, is that somehow this is fixed for life. This is very controversial within epigenetics because the DNA gets cleaned at the point of conception anyway. So the whole idea that you can have these methylated states passed on is controversial. And it can also happen after exercise and a variety of other things. So little is known about this. I should have said that the Dutch hunger winter and the Canadian ice storm, there are some effects, but they're actually quite minor on an effect size level. And the Canadian ice storm, they were actually able to disambiguate objective stress, like no food, water, light, heat, from levels of maternal anxiety. And the objective stress, surprise, surprise, was more predictive. But yet we don't seem to be focusing on objective stresses. So anyway, what they find, again in a nutshell, is that actually it's manual labour that is the most predictive thing in the Glasgow study. But that isn't what they highlight. What they highlight is they highlight that it might be fetal programming actually. So they say they speculate it might be a direct consequence of developmental programming in utero, but the study hasn't even attempted to study maternal diet or anything to do with it. And they say a link within utero a link within utero. Sorry, there's a space missing there. A link within utero programming is an attractive explanation. Attractive explanation, is it? As there is some evidence supporting the effect of a poor childhood environment and an increased risk of cardiovascular disorders. Indeed, in utero epigenetic programming has been linked to the development of obesity, arteriosclerosis, is this attractive? Well, no, not necessarily. How is it, Maurizio Maloney says, how likely is it in a society where class, race, gender and so on inequalities remain so vast that this is not going to somehow enter this field in particular ways? And the people of Glasgow don't seem to be terribly happy about it. This is one. I'm just flabbergasted by this latest research. I'm 81 years old and was born into what I would describe as extreme poverty, but with caring parents who were not into accepting charity. I'm just grateful that these statistics weren't available in my past. So what you have here is the effect of somebody arguing that one is biologically broken and that this is some kind of permanent change, and that the organism is somehow so porous that all manner of ordinary things are going to affect your optimal flourishing. And this is Becky Mansfield, who's writing in the States, where all this stuff is very racialised. The ugly side of epigenetics arises out of the heart of what makes epigenetics promising, that it focuses on plasticity rather than determinism, makes it open to intervention and improvement, even optimisation. But the notion of optimisation renders epigenetic changes as disorderly as damage, not adaptation. Things once normal, and this is a theme that has come through the day in a statistical sense, can become abnormal in the sense of not optimal. Just a couple of slides to show how dominant this is. Well, we talked about human capital. Here we have the lovely Early Intervention Foundation, my favourite organisation. Better right for children, better for the economy. We've got them wondering what genetics can tell us about targeting interventions. And this is the World Bank, on whose pages you can find clean water followed by amount of maternal eye contact, as if these two things are the same thing in terms of improving public health. So I'm just saying, are the neurological and molecular levels necessarily the most appropriate guide for the actions of the state? We're losing the category normal, it's shrinking all the time, and biological forms of reasoning are likely to result in opportunities for pharmacological interventions which may help some people, not necessarily for alleviating the conditions. One last thought in the context of today. When you look at that Buss et al. Study, nobody had a conversation with those women about what their life was like, what they were worried about. It's all about monitoring things at the biological level. the womb becomes a kind of sealed sci-fi space, an inhospitable endocrine bath in which the fetus is trapped against its will. And the things that the mother is experiencing irrelevant, potentially, if you concentrate on the molecular.
Thank you, Sue.